Nearly 30 years later, the nation's most infamous child murder mystery is suddenly alive again. New DNA technology, fresh investigative leadership, and accusations that police mishandled crucial evidence have reignited the JonBenét Ramsey case, and experts say 2025 could finally be the year the truth comes out. But after decades of dead ends, can anything really change now? On December 26, 1996, 6-year-old JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was reported missing from her family's Boulder, Colorado home, a case that shocked the world. 12 hours later, John Ramsey discovered her lifeless body in the basement. Autopsy later revealed she had been strangled with a garrote and suffered a fractured skull in an attack that still has no confirmed suspect. For decades, the case has stayed in the headlines, not due to resolution but because of mystery, controversy, and a trail of unanswered questions that refused to go cold. JonBenét wasn't just any missing child. She was a child beauty pageant queen, a 6-year-old with a bright smile and trophies on her shelf. The brutal nature of the crime, the bizarre ransom note left at the scene, and early police missteps turned this into America's original modern cold case. Errors during the initial investigation, including contamination of evidence and delayed control of the crime scene, have dogged law enforcement for decades and fueled public distrust. Early in the investigation, the Ramsey family was scrutinized like no others. In 2008, DNA testing cleared John and Patsy Ramsey and exonerated them in writing from the Boulder District Attorney's office. But cleared or not, conspiracy theories, rumors, and a media frenzy persisted, keeping the story alive in the public mind. And until recently, there were no meaningful new leads for years. After nearly 3 decades, a combination of modern DNA technology, renewed law enforcement focus, and pressure from JonBenét's family has pushed this decades-old murder case back into the spotlight. In 2025, heavy checkmark Boulder police publicly reaffirmed that the investigation remains a top priority. Heavy checkmark authorities are using cutting-edge DNA testing and forensic genealogy to re-examine evidence that was previously considered exhausted. Heavy checkmark the garrote used in the murder and other artifacts are now believed to hold untapped genetic clues using new technology. Heavy checkmark JonBenét's father, John Ramsey, has actively pushed for modern DNA labs and even public intervention to accelerate breakthroughs. Heavy checkmark JonBenét's brother has publicly criticized past police work, calling the original handling of the crime scene botched, and urging more aggressive investigation. Despite millions of tips, thousands of interviews, and decades of scrutiny, more than 21,000 tips have been recorded over the years. More than 1,000 people have been interviewed in relation to the murder. But no one has ever been charged or convicted for the crime. That's why 2025 isn't just another anniversary. It might be the moment everything changes. In this documentary series, we'll explore heavy checkmark the chaotic night JonBenét vanished, heavy checkmark the ransom note and its strange demands, heavy checkmark decades of police missteps and mishandling, heavy checkmark the first DNA breakthroughs in the 2000s, heavy checkmark and why new technology in 2025 could finally solve one of America's most haunting mysteries. Because sometimes, the truth waits for technology. What happened inside the Ramsey home on Christmas night is the foundation of every theory, every accusation, and every unanswered question. Miss one detail, and the entire case changes. It was supposed to be a quiet end to Christmas Day. The Ramseys had spent the evening at a friend's holiday party. JonBenét was tired, carried inside asleep. Patsy Ramsey later said she gently put her daughter to bed, still wearing parts of her festive outfit. No screams. No signs of fear. Nothing out of place. At least, that's how it appeared. John Ramsey checked the doors. Patsy prepared for the next morning's early flight to Michigan. Their son Burke went to his room. By all outward appearances, the house settled into silence. But sometime after midnight, something went terribly wrong. At approximately 5:52 a.m., Patsy Ramsey came downstairs. What she saw stopped her cold. 3 pages. Written by hand. Placed on the staircase. A ransom note. It claimed JonBenét had been kidnapped. The demand, $118,000, an oddly specific amount that matched John Ramsey's recent bonus. The message was long, rambling, emotional, threatening. Not the kind of note investigators typically see in child abduction cases. It warned the family not to call police. They called anyway. Within minutes, 911 was on the line, and the quiet home became a crime scene. Police arrived quickly. But this wasn't treated like a homicide. It was treated like a kidnapping. Friends were called over for support. People moved freely through the house. Rooms were entered. Surfaces were touched. Evidence, whether critical or minor, was already being compromised. No one knew it yet, but those first hours would haunt the investigation forever. Officers searched the home but did not find JonBenét. They waited for a ransom call that never came. The note said she was gone, but she wasn't. Hours passed. Anxiety grew. Confusion deepened. Then a detective made a decision that would change the case forever. Just after 1 p.m., John Ramsey was asked to search the house again, top to bottom. He went to the basement. There, behind a closed door in a little-used storage room, he found his daughter. JonBenét was lying on the floor. She was dead, bound, strangled. A garrote fashioned from household items tightened around her neck. The kidnapping narrative collapsed instantly. This was no ransom attempt. This was a murder. John Ramsey picked her up. He carried her upstairs. He placed her on the floor. In that moment, driven by shock, grief, and instinct, any remaining forensic integrity of the scene was lost. Fibers, DNA, positioning, context, gone. What should have been preserved was unknowingly destroyed. And from that moment on, the JonBenét Ramsey case would never be clean. If JonBenét was in the house the entire time, why was there a ransom note? Why demand money if the child was never taken? And why was the note so long, written calmly inside the home using materials from the house itself? These questions would fracture the investigation, and they would divide public opinion for decades. Every new DNA test, every modern forensic review, every renewed police effort, all of it traces back to this night. Because the answers aren't just in the evidence, they're in the mistakes, and those mistakes began here. Welcome to Coziness Stories. If you enjoy calm, immersive stories like this, take a moment to subscribe and make yourself at home. If this note was staged, it wasn't careless. If it was real, it was unlike anything investigators had ever seen. Either way, this single document redirected the entire case. The ransom note left inside the Ramsey home wasn't short. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't written on the fly. It was 3 handwritten pages long, drafted using a notepad and pen found inside the house, then carefully returned to where they belonged. That alone stunned investigators. Most ransom notes are brief, direct, demanding. This one read more like a monologue. The author claimed to represent a small foreign faction. They demanded $118,000, not a round number, not millions, but an amount that precisely matched John Ramsey's Christmas bonus. They instructed John to withdraw the money in specific denominations. They warned him not to involve police, yet made no real effort to ensure that didn't happen. And perhaps most chilling of all, they promised JonBenét would be beheaded if instructions weren't followed. But she was already dead. Handwriting experts later estimated the note took at least 20 minutes to write. That means whoever wrote it was not panicked. They were comfortable. They stayed inside the house. They took their time. And they did it after JonBenét was already incapacitated, or worse. This wasn't a quick crime. It was deliberate. Investigators later found something even more unsettling. A practice note, written on the same pad, using similar phrasing, abandoned mid-sentence. This wasn't spontaneous. This was rehearsed. And that raised a question investigators still wrestle with. Who would feel safe enough inside a family's home to practice a ransom note? Multiple handwriting experts examined the note. Some believed Patsy Ramsey could not be ruled out as the writer. Others said the handwriting was inconclusive. No expert definitively identified the author. But no expert definitively eliminated Patsy either. That ambiguity fueled suspicion and media frenzy for years. Even after the Ramseys were formally cleared by DNA evidence in 2008, the note continued to cast a shadow. There was no call, no follow-up, no attempt to collect money, no proof of life, no escape plan. If this was a kidnapping, it failed before it began. Which leads to the most disturbing theory of all. The ransom note wasn't meant to get money. It was meant to explain a body. Many investigators came to believe the note served one purpose: to buy time, to misdirect, to frame the narrative before the truth emerged. Instead of searching for a killer, police spent crucial hours waiting for a phone call that would never come. Hours that could have preserved evidence. Hours that changed everything. Even with new DNA technology, the ransom note remains central. Because DNA can tell investigators who touched something. But the note tells them why. And until its true author is identified, the case remains split between theories. An intruder who stayed too long. Or someone who never left. If JonBenét was murdered in the house, who wrote the note? And who did they think they were fooling? Before police even knew JonBenét was dead, the most important evidence in the house was already disappearing. forever. By mid-morning on December 26, 1996, the Ramsey home was no longer a crime scene. It was a gathering place. Friends arrived. Neighbors came to comfort Patsy. Clergy moved through the house. Phones rang. People hugged. People cried. People cleaned. No one stopped them. Police failed to immediately secure the residence. There were no crime scene logs. No gloves for visitors. No restricted zones. Officers allowed people to walk freely through the home, over carpets, staircases, and hallways that may have contained trace evidence. Fibers were transferred. Footprints overlapped. Potential DNA was contaminated. This wasn't just an oversight. It was catastrophic. At around 1 p.m., Detective Linda Arndt made a critical decision. She asked John Ramsey and family friend Fleet White to conduct a final search of the house, top to bottom. This broke nearly every protocol. Civilians should never search an unsecured scene. But John complied. And within minutes, everything changed. In the basement wine cellar, an area previously checked, John Ramsey found JonBenét. She was on the floor, wrapped in a white blanket, her mouth covered with duct tape, a cord tied around her neck. She was clearly dead. John picked her up. He carried her upstairs. He laid her on the living room floor. In doing so, he unknowingly destroyed what little evidence remained. By moving the body, the original position was lost, a ligature evidence was disturbed, fibers were transferred, time of death analysis became harder. Every modern cold case expert agrees on one thing. That moment permanently damaged the investigation. Not because John Ramsey intended harm, but because police allowed it to happen. Even more troubling? Detective Arndt was the only officer in the house at that time. No backup. No forensic team. No supervisors. When JonBenét's body was brought upstairs, Arndt later said she felt something shift. She described locking eyes with John Ramsey and thinking, "I knew this was no kidnapping." That statement would later fuel years of suspicion and controversy. Some items were never properly examined. The basement windows and doors, a suitcase beneath the broken window, footprints near the wine cellar, and the flashlight later linked to the head injury. Other evidence was collected too late. Some was lost. Some was compromised. Some may never be known. Within hours, leaks reached the press. Rumors spread faster than facts. The Ramseys were portrayed as suspects before charges were ever considered. Public opinion formed early and never let go. Once that happened, the investigation became as much about optics as truth. Modern DNA testing can do incredible things, but it can't resurrect evidence that was never preserved. And many experts believe, even if the killer's DNA exists in the house, it may no longer be usable. Not because technology failed, but because procedure did. Was this case doomed the moment police treated a kidnapping like a family crisis? Or was something else already going wrong behind closed doors? If this story is drawing you in, subscribing to Coziness Stories helps you enjoy more tales like this every time you return. When the autopsy report came back, it shattered every assumption investigators thought they understood. JonBenét Ramsey was pronounced dead shortly after her body was found upstairs. By the next day, December 27, 1996, her body was transported to the Boulder County Coroner's Office. Behind closed doors, one examination would quietly redefine the entire case. And when the results emerged, they stunned everyone. The autopsy revealed two critical injuries. Blunt force trauma to the head or asphyxiation by strangulation. Either injury alone could have been fatal. But here's what made it disturbing. The head injury happened first. JonBenét had an 8.5-inch fracture across her skull. It was massive. Yet there was no external bleeding and no visible swelling and no immediate sign of trauma. Experts believe she may have been unconscious for 45 minutes to 2 hours before she was strangled. That time gap changed everything. This was not a sudden act. It suggested, if someone struck her, she didn't die immediately, as someone then made a second, deliberate decision. This wasn't panic. It looked controlled, calculated. The strangulation device was unlike anything seen in most child homicide cases. A cord was tied tightly around JonBenét's neck, attached to a broken paintbrush handle from Patsy Ramsey's art supplies. This was not a random household item. It appeared constructed, deliberate, almost ritualistic. Garrotes are extremely rare in domestic crimes, especially involving children. This raised terrifying questions. Why create a device instead of using hands? Why stage something so complex? Why combine blunt force trauma with strangulation? Some investigators began to suspect staging. Others thought it pointed to an outside offender. The case split down the middle. The autopsy also revealed signs of prior vaginal injury. Not conclusive sexual assault, but evidence of trauma that may have occurred before the night of the murder. This single detail would haunt the case for decades. Was it abuse? Was it accidental? Or was it something else entirely? Even today, experts disagree. If JonBenét had been abused before that night, it narrows suspect profiles, it challenges the intruder theory, or it raises questions investigators never fully answered. And yet, this lead was never thoroughly resolved. Before the family was fully briefed, details from the autopsy began leaking to the media. Graphic descriptions, speculation, sensational headlines. JonBenét's body became public property, and the Ramseys became suspects in the court of public opinion. John and Patsy Ramsey were devastated, but they were also angry. They believed police were using selective details to shape a narrative. From that moment on, cooperation between the family and investigators began to fracture. After the autopsy, the investigation divided into 3 theories. Keycap 1 intruder theory, a stranger entered the home. Keycap 2 family member theory, someone inside caused her death. Keycap 3 accidental injury plus staging, a blow went wrong followed by panic. Each theory had evidence. Each had flaws. None have been proven. It complicated it. It deepened suspicion. And it ensured one thing. JonBenét Ramsey's case would never be simple again. If the head injury didn't kill her immediately, why wasn't help called? Why wasn't 911 dialed? Why was a garrote made instead? One microscopic trace, so small it was almost ignored, would become the most controversial piece of evidence in modern true crime history. Buried inside the autopsy results was a finding that quietly contradicted everything investigators thought they knew. Foreign DNA. Not from John Ramsey. Not from Patsy Ramsey. Not from Burke Ramsey. DNA from an unknown male. And it was found in one of the most sensitive places possible. The DNA appeared in JonBenét's underwear, mixed with a small amount of blood, later confirmed on long johns she was wearing. This was not touch DNA from casual handling. It was biological material. And it did not match anyone in the Ramsey family. In most homicide cases, unknown male DNA would immediately shift the investigation outward. But in Boulder, something different happened. Investigators did not pivot. Instead, the DNA was downplayed, called contamination, called manufacturing residue, called inconclusive. But it never went away. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. It did not match known sex offenders and violent criminals, anyone connected to the Ramseys. And year after year, no match appeared. In 2008, Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey made a stunning announcement. Based on DNA evidence, the Ramsey family was officially cleared. Her office stated, "The evidence strongly suggests the presence of an unknown male suspect." This should have been the end of the family as suspects narrative. It wasn't. The Boulder Police Department rejected the DA's conclusion. They argued, the DNA was too small, it could be secondary transfer, it didn't prove an intruder. So the case stalled, again. 2 authorities, 2 interpretations, 0 resolution. Despite its importance, the DNA evidence rarely made headlines. Why? Because it didn't fit the story the public already believed. Family drama sells. Unknown DNA doesn't. So the most objective evidence in the case was quietly buried under speculation. Fast forward nearly 30 years. DNA technology has evolved dramatically. Touch DNA analysis, low copy number profiling, genetic genealogy, used in Golden State Killer case. Evidence once considered too small is now solvable. And suddenly, that old DNA mattered again. In 2025, renewed pressure from JonBenét's father, John Ramsey, and independent investigators has reignited calls for a modern DNA retesting, a genealogical tracing, or outside agency involvement. Experts now believe the unknown male DNA can be traced, if authorities allow it. If the DNA truly belongs to an intruder, then for decades, an innocent family lived under suspicion, a killer walked free, a case was steered in the wrong direction. And mistakes, not lack of evidence, kept it unsolved. One former investigator admitted off record, "If this DNA leads to someone, it will expose how badly this case was mishandled." That may be why progress has been slow. Locked in evidence storage. Unmatched. Unexplained. But no longer ignorable. If this DNA doesn't belong to the Ramseys, who does it belong to? And why hasn't that person been found? Before the autopsy was finished, before the evidence was secured, The JonBenét Ramsey case may have already been compromised. December 26, 1996. A quiet Boulder home. A ransom note on the stairs. From the very first hour, protocol collapsed. Instead of treating the house like a crime scene, police treated it like a living room. Friends were invited over. People moved freely. Surfaces were touched. Evidence was overwritten by footsteps, fingerprints, and chaos. This wasn't negligence. It was catastrophic. JonBenét was missing. That alone should have triggered a full lockdown, a perimeter, a room-by-room forensic sweep. Instead, officers allowed family friends to clean the kitchen, people to console each other on couches, doors to open and close repeatedly. The home where a child vanished was never secured. Hours later, John Ramsey was asked to search the house. Not with police. Alone. He opened the basement door and found his daughter's body. From that moment on, the scene was irreversibly altered. JonBenét was carried upstairs, placed on the living room floor, covered with a blanket. Any remaining forensic integrity was gone. Former homicide investigators later said, "You never ask a parent to search their own home during a kidnapping." Yet Boulder police did, and it changed everything. The ransom note, 3 pages long, was one of the strangest in criminal history. But police made critical errors. They didn't immediately isolate it, they allowed multiple people to handle it, they failed to preserve the original writing surface. Later handwriting analysis became controversial because of this. Too many hands. Too much time. Too little control. Instead of exploring multiple possibilities, investigators narrowed in fast. The Ramseys became suspects almost immediately. That decision shaped every move afterward. Evidence that supported guilt was emphasized. Evidence that suggested an intruder was questioned, minimized, or ignored. This is called confirmation bias. And once it starts, cases rarely recover. Several potential intruder clues were never fully pursued. An open basement window, a broken suitcase positioned beneath it, unidentified boot prints, a rope found nearby. Each detail alone meant little. Together, they told a story police didn't want to hear. Early on, the FBI reviewed the case. They quickly concluded it did not match typical kidnapping patterns. But they also noted something else. The local department was overwhelmed, inexperienced, unprepared for a case of this magnitude. The FBI stepped aside, and Boulder police were left to navigate a storm they weren't equipped for. In 1999, a grand jury secretly reviewed the case. Years later, it was revealed they voted to indict the Ramseys, not for murder but for child endangerment. Yet the DA refused to prosecute. Why? Because the evidence wasn't strong enough to win. This contradiction fueled decades of speculation. Indicted but not charged. Suspected but not convicted. Cleared but not believed. Cold case experts reviewing the file now agree on one thing. This case wasn't unsolved because of lack of evidence. It was unsolved because of how evidence was handled. Mistakes compounded. Early errors couldn't be undone. If the Ramseys were innocent, if a family was publicly destroyed, a killer went free, a child never received justice. If they weren't, a flawed investigation still failed to prove it. Either way, the system failed JonBenét. Was this incompetence? Or was it fear? Fear of admitting mistakes in one of America's most watched cases? Because acknowledging failure now would mean admitting the truth then was lost. Evidence contaminated. Narratives locked in. Public opinion hardened. And the one person who mattered most never got answers. Stories feel better when shared. Subscribe to Coziness Stories and join a space made for quiet moments and deep stories. Before a courtroom ever heard the case, America had already made up its mind. Within days of JonBenét Ramsey's death, the investigation slipped out of law enforcement's hands and into the media. Cable news panels, tabloids, talk radio, true crime specials. The case didn't just become news, it became entertainment. The Ramseys weren't just grieving parents. They were wealthy or well-spoken and media-aware or defensive under pressure. To many viewers, they didn't look the way grieving parents were expected to look. And in America, perception often outweighs proof. Television analysts replayed every moment. Patsy's 911 call, John's interviews, their refusal to sit down with police immediately. Each pause, each word choice, each facial expression. Everything was framed as suspicious. But psychologists later pointed out something crucial. Trauma doesn't look the same on everyone. Some people cry. Some shut down. Some over-control. The media didn't care. They wanted a story. Confidential police details began appearing in newspapers. Handwriting experts. Partial autopsy findings. Anonymous sources close to the investigation. None of it had been tested in court. But once it was printed, it was believed. These leaks weren't accidental. They shaped public perception and possibly jury pools for years. Headlines screamed, "Mother's note. Did the father snap?" Family secrets exposed. Speculation was sold as investigation. The more shocking the claim, the higher the ratings. Truth was optional. Eventually, John and Patsy Ramsey hired attorneys and PR advisors. That move was portrayed as guilt. But any defense attorney will tell you, innocent people lawyer up too, especially when cameras are everywhere. Still, the damage was done. To the public, silence meant guilt. Speaking out meant manipulation. There was no winning. Daytime television dissected the case like gossip. Late-night comedians made jokes. True crime experts diagnosed the family from clips. No cross-examination. No rules of evidence. No consequences. America didn't just watch the case. It judged it. Witnesses hesitated to come forward. False tips flooded police lines. Real leads drowned in noise. If someone in that house committed the murder, then explain the DNA that doesn't belong to anyone who lived there. For years, the JonBenét Ramsey case rested on opinion. But buried inside the evidence files was something colder than speculation. DNA. Not just trace amounts. Not contamination-level fragments. But foreign male DNA. And it didn't match the Ramseys. This wasn't one random spot. The DNA appeared in multiple critical locations. At JonBenét's underwear, under her fingernails, on clothing tied directly to the crime. Independent labs confirmed it. More than once. This wasn't a lab mistake. If the murder happened entirely inside the family, it was staged. If it was an accident covered up, then why does DNA from an unknown male exist at the center of it all? There are only two possibilities. The DNA is meaningless contamination. It belongs to the person who killed her. And experts increasingly lean toward the second. In 2008, new DNA testing led to a shocking development. The Boulder District Attorney officially cleared the Ramsey family. Publicly. In writing. The reason? The DNA evidence. The announcement didn't dominate headlines. It didn't undo decades of suspicion. But legally, it changed everything. By then, the narrative was already fixed. People didn't trust the DA. They didn't trust the timing. They didn't trust the science. Or worse, they didn't want to let go of what they believed. In the 1990s, DNA databases were limited. Today, they're powerful. Familial DNA, genealogical tracing, cross-border matching. The same technology that solved the Golden State Killer case could, in theory, identify JonBenét's killer. So why hasn't it happened? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Evidence ownership is fragmented, testing approvals are political, agencies don't agree on next steps. And reopening the case fully would mean admitting past failures. Institutions resist that. The DNA gives weight to questions long dismissed. Was someone already inside the house? Did they enter through the basement window? Did they know the family's routine? Suddenly those fringe ideas don't sound so fringe. Every few years the DNA comes back into focus. New technology, new experts, new pressure. Each time it asks the same question. Who does this DNA belong to? And why haven't we found them? What if the killer has lived freely for decades? What if they watched interviews, documentaries, accusations, knowing the truth was sitting quietly in a database waiting? This isn't a dead end. It's a stalled engine. And one decision, one green light, could restart everything. It doesn't watch TV. It doesn't read headlines. It doesn't remember theories. It only tells the truth. And it's still there. If the Ramseys weren't responsible, then someone else was standing in the shadows the entire time. Once police fixated on the family, the investigation narrowed. Dangerously. Leads that didn't fit the narrative were deprioritized. Tips pointing elsewhere stalled. Names surfaced, then quietly disappeared from the file. This chapter is about those names. Early on, several signs suggested someone unfamiliar to the family. Unidentified DNA or a broken basement window or a suitcase positioned beneath it, marks consistent with a stun gun, still debated. To many investigators outside Boulder, this screamed unauthorized entry. Inside Boulder? It was brushed aside as unlikely. The Ramsey home wasn't a fortress. Housekeepers had keys, contractors came and went, friends knew the layout. One former worker reportedly knew the basement well. Another had commented on JonBenét before. These weren't strangers. They were people with access and familiarity. JonBenét was visible. Very visible. Her photos were printed, broadcast, circulated. Some investigators later raised an uncomfortable question. Could someone have become fixated? A stalker theory was explored, but never deeply pursued. No full background sweeps. No exhaustive elimination. Just assumptions. The ransom note remains one of the strangest documents in criminal history. 3 pages long. Written inside the home. Using family materials. Some analysts excluded Patsy Ramsey. Others didn't. But here's what often gets overlooked. Several non-family individuals were never fully compared. The list was incomplete. And once attention turned inward, it stayed there. One name resurfaced again and again over the years. A man who played Santa at JonBenét's pageants. He reportedly knew personal details about her. He later wrote a disturbing poem. He was interviewed, but never charged. DNA later excluded him. Still, the fact that he wasn't fully ruled out early remains controversial. Cold case experts reviewing the file later identified a pattern. If a lead complicated the family theory, it slowed, it stalled, it faded. This isn't conspiracy. It's human behavior. Once people believe they know the answer, they stop asking new questions. Here's the problem police still can't solve. The unknown male DNA doesn't match. Family of friends and known suspects, anyone in Cody's. That means the real suspect may never have been interviewed, never questioned, never considered. What if the killer was someone briefly inside the home, as someone who left no other trace, as someone who blended into the noise afterward? Not a monster hiding in plain sight, but an ordinary person who slipped through cracks. With modern genealogy tools, ignored suspects matter again. Old lists get revisited. Discarded names come back. Assumptions get tested. And this time, DNA decides who stays and who falls. It's waiting on courage. The courage to reopen doors. To challenge old beliefs. To admit the wrong suspect may have been chased for decades. If police had looked outward sooner, would JonBenét's killer already be known? You're listening to Coziness Stories. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next story waiting for you. After decades of silence, one question forced its way back into the room. What if the technology finally caught up to the truth? For years, the JonBenét Ramsey case lived in a strange limbo, too famous to forget, too complicated to solve. Then quietly, without a press conference or headline banner, something changed. In 2025, investigators acknowledged what critics had argued for decades. The case was never truly finished. The unidentified male DNA, found on JonBenét's clothing, has always been the center of gravity. What changed wasn't the evidence. It was what could now be done with it. Modern forensic genealogy doesn't need a suspect anymore. It builds family trees from fragments. It narrows possibilities without names. Cold cases across the US have fallen this way. And suddenly JonBenét's file looked solvable. In early 2025, renewed public interest surged. Investigative journalists reopened the timeline, a former detective spoke publicly. Some for the first time, forensic experts criticized early mistakes on record. Social media amplified everything. A generation that didn't grow up with the case was discovering it fresh, and asking harder questions. Why wasn't the crime scene sealed? Why did potential suspects go untested? Why did internal disagreements derail the investigation? John Ramsey, now older and relentless, publicly renewed his call. Test everything. Test it again. Use today's science. The family requested independent DNA testing, federal-level review, full transparency of remaining evidence. For the first time in years, those requests weren't ignored. Behind closed doors, law enforcement acknowledged something critical. Early tunnel vision hurt the case. That admission, quiet but real, opened the door for re-evaluation. Old suspects were reconsidered. Old conclusions were re-examined. And evidence once thought inconclusive gained new life. This time, 3 things align. Technology, forensic genealogy is no longer experimental. Pressure, public scrutiny is relentless. Distance, investigators now review the case without 1996 politics. The narrative is no longer about blame. It's about resolution. While details remain sealed, sources confirm. DNA samples are being reprocessed, genetic profiles are being uploaded for genealogy comparison, new leads are being quietly followed. No suspects named. No arrests announced. But movement, real movement, has begun. There is one fear investigators won't say out loud. What if the DNA leads to someone who's already dead? or someone protected by time, jurisdiction, or legal complexity. Even a breakthrough doesn't guarantee justice, but it guarantees answers. JonBenét Ramsey has become more than a case. She represents every investigation mishandled too early, every truth delayed by assumptions, every family left waiting. This case is solved now. It changes how cold cases are treated forever. The evidence is ready. The technology is ready. The question is whether the system is ready to face what it finds. The evidence never forgot. The question is, were we ever ready to listen? JonBenét Ramsey will always be 6 years old. Frozen in pageant photos. Frozen in headlines. Frozen in a moment the world refuses to let fade. But time didn't stop for the case. Just waited. Justice doesn't always arrive with handcuffs. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. A name. A lineage. A truth that finally aligns every unanswered question. For nearly 30 years, speculation filled the silence. Blame without proof. Theories without resolution. A family tried and retried in the court of public opinion. But evidence doesn't care about narratives. It only cares about facts. The DNA found on JonBenét's clothing has never changed its story. It has never matched the Ramseys. It has never been explained away. And it has never been eliminated. Now, for the first time, technology can ask a question investigators couldn't in 1996. Who does this DNA belong to, and where does it lead? Every year that passed carried a price. A witnesses aged, a memories faded, a suspects died, opportunities vanished. And yet, some truths survive time. This one did. If genealogy identifies the source, if a name finally emerges, it will rewrite everything. The investigation, the public narrative, the legacy of one of America's most infamous unsolved cases. It won't undo what happened, but it will end the guessing. There is a possibility no one wants to confront. That the truth will implicate someone never publicly suspected. Someone ordinary. Someone who lived a full life while JonBenét never got the chance. That outcome won't feel satisfying, but it will be honest, because JonBenét Ramsey isn't just a cold case. She's a warning, a reminder that early mistakes echo for decades. Media pressure can distort justice, and science, when ignored, always waits patiently. If this case is solved now, it sets a precedent. Cold cases don't expire. Truth doesn't decay. And accountability can still arrive, late but real. When the truth finally has a name, will the world accept it? Or will the story we told ourselves for decades be harder to let go than the mystery itself? JonBenét Ramsey was silenced in 1996. The evidence never was. Thank you for spending this moment with Coziness Stories. Subscribe, rest easy, and I'll see you in the next story.